speaker. It's Huang. He is a research fellow at the Singapore Institute of Clinical Sciences, and he's going to talk about correcting for superficial bias in gradient echo fMRI.
All right. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Huang, and I'm actually presenting some of my previous work done at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at the University of Cambridge. So I'll be talking about correcting superficial bias in 70 gradient echo fMRI. And I'll be approaching this using both computational simulations and actual fMRI results. So gradient echo fMRI is a very popular sequence for studies at 70 because firstly, it's very simple to apply and it's very easy to implement in scanners as compared to some of the newer sequences such as ASL or VASO. And it also has the advantage of having some of the highest signal to noise ratio. And so like there's a figure here which shows the comparison between the various methods that can be used for fMRI at 70. But of course, we must highlight that gradient echo has a big drawback, which is the presence of superficial bias. And this is where larger signal changes are observed in the superficial layers as compared to the deep layers. So the problem with superficial bias is very well established in literature, as you can see from all these figures. And all of them show the near identical trend of increasing signal towards superficial layers across all their different paradigms. And this also observed to affect both raw responses as well as experimental effects, such as attentional modulation, as seen from these two 2020 papers. Another interesting thing to highlight here is that there's also another trend present here, which is there's increasing variance as we go towards the superficial layers. And this shows that there's likely some correlation between increasing signal and increasing noise. And this is actually something that some researchers have tried to use to correct for superficial bias, as I'll show later. Okay, so to solve the problem of superficial bias, multiple different methods have been utilized in the literature, and people have also attempted to model the bias. So the below figure here, this figure, is taken from Haber's blog, and it beautifully illustrates the three main methods: linear offset, multiplicative, and leakage models that are being explored currently, as well as the proposed methods of correction for the respective models. So with this understanding of the background, we set forth our goals, which is to build a computational model to generate simulated fMRI data. We can then test out various correction methods on this data and evaluate how good each method is. Finally, we can then validate the results from our model on real fMRI data. So to give a brief illustration of paradigm, I won't go into too much detail because of time constraints, but I just want to highlight that we have two task conditions, which is task D plus and task D minus, and they differ in that there's a distractor present or absent, while the participant is attending to the diagonal of interest. And if you're interested in a paradigm, our paper, actually, we have published a paper on this data already, and it's described in this paper, link below. Okay, so for our computational model, we decided to use the multiplicative model of superficial bias. We simulated a time course of 2,500 voxels, which is roughly the size of the ROI in our real data. And we started from a neural level. So the voxel response for each stimuli is obtained by taking the product of the firing rate, the neural density, and the attentional modulation. The firing rate is simply 1 when the stimulus is present and 0 when absent, while the neural density for each voxel is randomly sampled from a half normal distribution. The variance of the distribution is adjusted to capture the global preference of the ROI. So for example, if we were to simulate the FFA, we will sample from a half normal distribution with higher variance for phase responsive neuronal density. The attentional modulation is set as 1 for passive viewing and greater than 1 for attending. And the total voxel response is then obtained by summing across all stimuli conditions. Then we generated the voxel time course by multiplying the voxel response with the design matrix of our experiment. Lastly, we added in physiological and thermal noise, as well as the multiplicative superficial bias to obtain the overall measured time course, which is what we get from our fMRI data. So the parameters for our simulation were chosen to best fit our fMRI dataset. As you can see from the figures here, the mean and the standard deviation of the t-statistic of our simulation closely match that of our real data. And we generate a scatter plot of the voxel responses for the simulated data and the real data. You can see that they are in good agreement as well. We validated 6 different correction methods in our simulation, and each method was iterated over 10,000 times to generate an average response, average result. And if you're interested in our code or the actual simulation results, our GitHub page is linked here. Okay, so with our simulation setup, we chose these six methods to evaluate. Of these, some have been used in the past, while some are more novel. For example, Deming regression is a method proposed by us as an improvement to the ROI ratio metric previously used. So we can broadly classify these metrics into three groups: the ratio metrics, z-scoring, and multi-voxel pattern analysis methods. So the six underlying methods are what was used in our simulation. So ratio metrics are a very intuitive approach if we expect the bias to follow a multiplicative model. By taking a ratio of the two signal changes, we can remove the effect of the bias L and recover the ratio of the underlying response as seen from this equation. However, because we have a large number of voxels, there are multiple ways to take the ratio. So firstly, the simplest way is to calculate a ratio for each individual voxel and average across all voxels. However, this method is prone to be distorted by extreme values, especially for voxels when task D minus contrast is close to 0. So this whole ratio will go to become a very large number. One way around this, which is the ROI ratio, is to take a sum or average across all voxels first, and then taking the ratio of the two metrics. In this way, you can regularize it to become more controlled, but it comes at a cost because this becomes a univariate metric, and you can discarding potentially important regional pattern information. Lastly, Deming regression, which is proposed by us, is by simply obtaining by regressing one condition against the other and then taking a gradient. So we chose to use Deming regression instead of ordinary least squares because Deming regression accounts for the error in both variables. An alternative approach, which has been previously used by Lawrence et al. And others, was to normalize the original time course using z-scoring before fitting the GLM. So this is what I was talking about when they're trying to use the noise to normalize the signal. And so that's the idea that they're trying to implement here. And lastly, the last class of correction methods is the Mvpa methods, where we evaluate the ability of the classifier to classify the attended category using voxel information. So this approach similarly relies on the observation that both noise and the signal of interest scales with superficial bias. And here we evaluated two methods: a classical support vectors machine SVM and a linear discriminant contrast method. So these two diagrams illustrate the differences between the two methods. This is a simple two voxel example. And if you're interested in reading more about the comparison between the two methods, we have a paper link below that goes over it. So we first simulated on the most basic case, which is constant attentional modulation across layers. So on the far left, you can see that you have a very nice flat attentional profile that is fed into the model. And the measured response shows a clear increasing trend towards the superficial layers, showing that our model is generating data with the expected profile. For the ratio metrics, you can see that both Deming regression and ROI ratio are able to accurately capture the flat attentional profile, while voxel ratio shows high instability, similar to our expectations. Z-scoring, SVM classification, and LDC all show a strong superficial profile, superficial bias, and thus are probably unsuitable for NS for usage. So next, we simulated a V-shaped attentional profile, which is what we might expect based on previous neuroanatomical data. Similar to what we observed with constant attentional modulation, both Deming regression and ROI ratio is able to recover the underlying attentional profile, whereas voxel ratio is highly unstable. And you can see that it's unsuitable because the noise will definitely mask any true attentional profile that's underlying. LDC, SVM, and Z-scoring all show somewhat of a V-shaped profile, but there's still a substantial amount of superficial bias present, so it's likely unsuitable for this purpose. Lastly, to highlight the difference between univariate and multivariate approaches, we repeated the same simulation, but we removed the global preference, which means what we did was we sampled both neural densities from the same half normal distribution. So you can see that from the measured response that there isn't a regional mean contrast left over. So thus, because of this lack of regional mean contrast, ROI ratio, which is a univariate method, becomes highly unstable as well. Whereas Deming regression, which is more multivariate, will be able to still capture the underlying attentional profile and still stable. So similarly, SVM classification and LDC, which are both multivariate methods, are also able to capture the V-shape profile. But again, there's still an element of laminar bias present, which is why they're unsuitable. So we now applied the 6 question methods to our data, our real fMRI data set. You can see that our raw data has nice laminar bias, but when we apply like Deming regression or ROI ratio, they both show very nice horizontal profiles. And whereas like voxel ratio is highly unstable, you can see from the insert, it has like it's extremely unstable and definitely should not be used to analyze the laminar data. Z-scoring, SVM classification, and LDC all show some amount of superficial bias. And this is what we're trying to highlight, is that it's important to correct for superficial bias, because if you were to look at one of these 3 metrics, or like even all of these 3, you might draw an erroneous conclusion that there's stronger signal in the superficial layers. Whereas like based on our simulation and our data that I showed previously, it's likely that the correct conclusion from this set of data is that it's likely that there's like a flat attentional profile as shown by Deming regression or ROI ratio. And so in conclusion, I would like to stress the importance of correcting for superficial bias in gradient echo fMRI, because it's very easy to draw wrong conclusions based on the superficial bias. And so using our results, we recommend using ROI ratio or Deming regression depending on whether there is a mean global preference or no global preference. Deming regression also has an added advantage in that it's a multi-voxel approach, so it might be preferable if there are other voxel pattern data that can be exploited. However, it's important to note that our results is only simulating a multiplicative bias model, and while we have some validation from real fMRI data, it's possible that alternative models such as leakage model might give different conclusions, and this is something that we would like to work on improving with our future simulations. All right, so I would like to thank my supervisors, collaborators, and everyone else who helped out with our work. Yeah, and thank you. So this is the link to our code and my email if you have any questions.
Thank you. That was a very nice and concise presentation. And the link is also in the chat box for the attendees. Any questions? And the panelists are welcome to ask questions as well. Yeah, I had a quick question more in terms of, I know now you've transitioned to a new lab. Are there other research questions and data sets that you're going to apply these algorithms to, these methods to? And do you think the results or the outcomes might be different depending on the area or the task?
So I think that this is actually, because this simulation is a very general simulation, I think that it actually applies to almost all gradient echo data. And it was like, if you go back to like my introduction, I think, if I show here, you can see that because there's a wide range of paradigms have been explored at 70, and all of them still show very similar profile. So it's likely that this is something that is constant across all regions.
Thank you. Any other questions? Last chance, one more question. All right, thank you. And we'll transition to our third speaker.